Picture this: a world where cultures thrived on rituals so strange, so far beyond our modern imagination, that even the most daring among us would hesitate to participate. Ancient civilizations didn't just honor their gods or mark the passage of time. They engaged in practices that defy logic, challenge our sense of normality, and sometimes send chills down our spines. From blood-soaked ceremonies to rites that blurred the line between life and death, these traditions were woven into the fabric of societies long gone, leaving behind whispers of their shocking legacy. And today, we're about to pull back the curtain on 25 of the most bizarre rituals from ancient times, each one more unsettling, more unbelievable than the last. What drove these cultures to embrace such extreme acts? Was it devotion, fear, or something deeper, a connection to forces we've long since forgotten? Some rituals were meant to appease wrathful deities, while others served as brutal tests of strength or loyalty. Imagine walking into a temple where priests wore the skins of sacrificed victims, or witnessing a festival where participants danced with skulls to honor the dead. These weren't just stories, they were real, lived experiences for countless people across centuries, shaping civilizations in ways we're still struggling to comprehend. But here's the thing: these rituals weren't just about shock value. Behind every strange tradition lies a rich tapestry of meaning, a glimpse into how our ancestors saw the world. What seems grotesque or irrational to us once held profound significance, binding communities together, marking the cycles of nature, or even warding off catastrophe. And as we journey through these 25 astonishing practices, you'll discover how the line between the sacred and the surreal was often thinner than we think. So brace yourself, because history is about to get a lot stranger, a lot darker, and far more fascinating than you ever expected. Among the most startling rituals from the ancient world was the Mayan bloodletting ceremony, a practice where royalty didn't just offer prayers to their gods but gave something far more personal: their own blood. Picture a king or queen standing atop a temple, gripping a stingray spine or a razor-sharp jade knife, deliberately piercing their tongue, ears, or even genitals to let blood flow onto strips of bark paper. This wasn't an act of madness but a sacred duty, rooted in the belief that blood was the ultimate offering, a bridge between the human world and the divine. For the Maya, blood wasn't just a physical substance, it carried the very essence of life force, known as Chulul. They believed the gods had shed their own blood to create humanity, and in return, humans had to reciprocate to sustain the cosmic balance. Without these sacrifices, the sun might not rise, crops would fail, and chaos could engulf the world. But this ritual wasn't just about spirituality, it was deeply political. When a ruler publicly endured this pain, it demonstrated their strength and commitment, proving they were worthy of leading their people. The timing of these ceremonies was no accident. They often coincided with key agricultural cycles or celestial events, like the solstices or the appearance of Venus. One of the most famous depictions comes from the lintels of Yaxchilan, where Queen Lady Zok is shown pulling a thorn-lined rope through her tongue, her blood pooling into a bowl filled with paper destined for burning. The smoke carried their prayers upward, a direct line to the gods. What's truly striking is how normalized this was in Mayan society. Far from being hidden or taboo, these acts were celebrated in art and inscriptions, immortalized as moments of divine connection. Yet for all its grandeur, the bloodletting ritual wasn't without risk. Infection, excessive blood loss, or even death could follow. But to the Maya, that danger only heightened its sacred power. To bleed was to speak to the gods, and in a world where survival depended on their favor, no cost was too high. If the Mayan bloodletting rituals reveal how deeply intertwined pain and devotion could be, the ancient Egyptians took reverence for the divine in a different and surprisingly adorable direction. They didn't just mummify their pharaohs, they preserved their pets with the same meticulous care, from beloved cats to sacred crocodiles. entombing them alongside humans or in vast underground cemeteries devoted solely to animals. This wasn't mere sentimentality. It was a sacred contract between the people and their gods, where every mummified creature served as a bridge to the afterlife. Take the cult of Bastet, the lioness-headed goddess of home and protection, who later took the form of a domesticated cat. Egyptians believed these animals carried her divine essence, so harming one was punishable by death, even accidentally. When a cat died, households would shave their eyebrows in mourning, then send the body to embalmers who would carefully remove its organs, pack the cavity with natron salt, and wrap it in linen strips adorned with intricate beadwork. Some were placed in tiny wooden sarcophagi shaped like cats, their faces painted with delicate whiskers and wide, watchful eyes. Archaeologists have uncovered entire necropolises, like the one at Bubastes, where millions of cat mummies were stacked in labyrinthine tunnels, all destined to serve as eternal offerings. But cats weren't the only animals granted this honor. Dogs, linked to Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead, were mummified to guide souls through the underworld. Crocodiles, sacred to Sobek, were dried, wrapped, and sometimes given golden amulets to appease the god of the Nile's dangerous waters. Even ibises, associated with Thoth, the god of wisdom, were preserved by the thousands, their curved beaks tucked neatly against their bodies. What's truly fascinating is the scale of this practice. At Saqqara, a single underground catacomb held over 4 million ibis mummies, while elsewhere, crocodiles measuring 12 feet long were found with their jaws bound shut to prevent chaos in the afterlife. The process wasn't always perfect. Some animal mummies were discovered to be empty, likely a result of priests struggling to meet demand. Yet for the Egyptians, intention mattered more than perfection. These creatures weren't just pets, they were divine messengers, and sending them into the next world ensured favor from the gods. The depth of this belief reveals something unexpected, an ancient world where love for animals and devotion to the divine were inseparable. To hold a mummified kitten in your hands today is to touch a civilization that saw the sacred in every purr, every bark, every ripple of the Nile. For them, death wasn't an end but a doorway, and no faithful companion would be left behind. While the Egyptians mummified animals with solemn reverence, the Romans had a ritual so wild, so dangerously uninhibited, that it sent the entire empire into a moral panic. The Bacchanalia, a secretive cult dedicated to Bacchus, the god of wine and ecstasy, began as an innocent harvest festival but spiraled into whispered tales of orgies, bloodshed, and nights so chaotic they threatened to unravel the very fabric of Roman society. By the time the Senate took brutal action in 186 BCE, the rumors alone were enough to paint this ritual as one of history's most scandalous. Originally, the Bacchanalia was a women-only ceremony, a peaceful celebration of fertility and the vine's bounty. But when it spread to Rome, something shifted. Men joined the ranks, the gatherings moved from daylight to darkness, and the rituals grew increasingly frenzied. Historians like Livy describe participants fueled by wine and possibly hallucinogenic herbs, dancing wildly to pounding drums, their bodies writhing in states of divine possession. The lines between worship and debauchery blurred. Whispers circulated of initiates being led blindfolded into hidden groves, where they'd engage in acts so taboo that speaking of them publicly was forbidden. Some accounts even alleged human sacrifices, with victims supposedly torn apart in a frenzy meant to channel Bacchus's primal energy. The Roman elite were horrified. To them, this wasn't just revelry, it was a threat to social order. The cult's secrecy bred paranoia. What if slaves or political enemies were using these gatherings to plot rebellions? The Senate's response was swift and merciless. Thousands of suspected Bacchanalia followers were arrested, tortured, or executed. The decree banning the rituals was so severe that copies were posted across Italy, a stark warning etched in bronze. Yet the cult didn't vanish entirely. It retreated underground, its rituals stripped of their most extreme elements, surviving in quieter, sanctioned forms. What makes the Bacchanalia so fascinating isn't just its excesses, but what it reveals about Roman fears. This was a society built on discipline and control, where even dinner parties had strict rules. The idea of surrendering to unchecked ecstasy, of losing oneself in a crowd, wasn't just shocking, it was revolutionary. The Senate didn't just fear the riots or the sex, they feared the loss of boundaries, the moment when worship became a wildfire no one could contain. And in that crackdown, we see a timeless tension, the clash between order and abandon, between the civilization we build and the primal urges that never quite leave us. Few images from the ancient world capture the imagination like a Viking funeral pyre blazing against the night sky, its flames reflecting on dark waters as a ship carrying the dead drifts into the unknown. This wasn't just cremation, it was a spectacle of honor, a send-off so lavish it blurred the line between myth and reality. When a Viking chieftain died, their people didn't merely bury them. They built a floating fortress of fire, stocked with everything the deceased might need in the afterlife: weapons for battle, treasure for prestige, and even the lives of those who would serve them beyond death. One of the most chilling first-hand accounts comes from Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab traveler who witnessed a Rus Viking funeral along the Volga River in the 10th century. His detailed notes paint a scene both mesmerizing and horrifying. For days, the community prepared, dressing the chieftain in his finest clothes and placing him in a temporary grave with offerings of fruit and alcohol. Then came the centerpiece, a great ship pulled ashore, its deck transformed into a funeral bed piled with silks, armor, and sacrificed animals. But the most unsettling figure in this ritual was the woman known as the Angel of Death, an older female relative who presided over the ceremony with eerie authority. Ibn Fadlan describes how she orchestrated every detail, from selecting a young slave girl to accompany the chieftain to the afterlife to leading the final, frenzied rites. As the girl drank ritual beverages and sang what were believed to be her last happy songs, the community raised a wooden structure around the ship, creating a chamber of flame. When the moment came, the Angel of Death herself allegedly stabbed the girl, a grim act meant to secure her passage as the chieftain's attendant. Then the torches were thrown and the pyre erupted, consuming ship, master, and servant alike in a fire so intense it left only ashes and iron behind. What's striking is how every element served a purpose. The ship symbolized the journey to Valhalla or Helheim. The weapons guaranteed readiness for the wars of the afterlife, and the sacrifices reinforced the hierarchy of death, where even servants had roles to play. Archaeologists have found echoes of these rituals in sites like Oseberg, where a lavishly decorated ship held the remains of two women, possibly a queen and her servant, surrounded by sleds, tapestries, and even sacrificed horses. For the Vikings, this wasn't just destruction, it was transformation. The flames didn't erase life, they released it, sending smoke and spirit upward to the gods. In that fiery moment, the boundary between worlds grew thin, and the dead were given not just a burial but a spectacle worthy of sagas. To stand on those shores centuries ago would have been to witness something unthinkable today. Death not as an end but as a voyage, lit by fire and fueled by unwavering belief. Imagine walking into the heart of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, and coming face to face with a structure that defies modern comprehension, a towering rack of skulls stretching as high as a temple, each one staring back at you with hollow eyes. This was the Tes Ampantli, a chilling monument where the skulls of sacrificial victims were displayed like macabre trophies. But to the Aztecs, these weren't just warnings to enemies, they were sacred offerings, a direct line to the gods that kept the very cosmos in balance. The scale of these skull racks was staggering. Spanish conquistadors like Bernal Diaz del Castillo described them in horrified detail, dozens of wooden poles strung with skulls arranged in neat rows, some so weathered by sun and rain that they crumbled at a touch. Recent excavations at the Templo Mayor in Mexico City have revealed just how vast these structures were. Archaeologists unearthed a section of the main T's, apparently containing over 600 skulls, with estimates suggesting the original display held tens of thousands. What's even more unsettling, many belonged to children. Isotopic analysis shows some were brought from distant regions, likely captured in wars or traded as tribute, their lives given to appease Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war. But why skulls? For the Aztecs, blood and bone were more than mere flesh, they were life force itself. The T's apparently wasn't just a display, it was a recycling of energy. Skulls were meticulously cleaned, drilled with holes and threaded onto wooden spikes, their empty sockets facing outward as a reminder of the god's hunger. Some scholars believe the arrangement mirrored the Aztec cosmos, with the skulls representing stars in a celestial map. Others argue they served as a psychological weapon, broadcasting the empire's might to rivals and rebels alike. When enemy diplomats visited, the message was clear: resist, and this could be your fate. The child sacrifices add another layer of grim complexity. Unlike adult captives, these younger victims may have been chosen for their purity, their untainted blood considered especially potent. Some skulls show signs of ritualistic defleshing, their bones polished smooth before display. It's a haunting contrast to the Aztecs' advanced society, their bustling markets, their floating gardens, all underpinned by this unflinching devotion to divine demands. What makes the T's apparently so unsettling isn't just its brutality, but how normalized it was. This wasn't hidden or secret. It stood at the city's center, a daily reminder that life depended on death. To modern eyes, it's a horror. To the Aztecs, it was as routine as planting crops or raising temples. In those silent, staring skulls, we see a civilization that worshipped the sun but walked in shadow, convinced that without these offerings, the world itself would go dark. High atop the slopes of Mount Parnassus, where the air thins and the earth itself seems to whisper, the Temple of Delphi housed one of antiquity's most enigmatic rituals. Here, the Pythia, Apollo's chosen priestess, would descend into a sunken chamber, perch atop a three-legged stool, and breathe in vapors rising from cracks in the rock below. Within moments, her body would convulse, her voice deepen, and words tumbled forth in jagged, cryptic phrases. These weren't mere hallucinations, they were prophecies that shaped empires, swayed wars, and determined the fates of kings. And the secret behind her divine madness, a cocktail of gases, including ethylene, seeping from the very bones of the earth. Modern science has peeled back the veil on this ancient mystery. Geologists discovered that Delphi sits atop two intersecting fault lines, where underground springs heated by tectonic activity released a mix of ethylene, a sweet-smelling gas known to induce euphoria and trance-like states. Archaeologist John Hale and chemist Gel de Boer confirmed this in the late 20th century, analyzing traces of these gases in the temple's foundation. The Pythia didn't just meditate or chant, she was chemically altered, her mind thrust into a liminal space between the human and divine. Yet the oracle's power wasn't just in the vapors, it was in the theater. Before consulting the Pythia, pilgrims underwent days of purification, bathing in the Castalian spring and offering sacrifices. By the time they reached the dimly lit Aditon, the priestess's writhing figure and rasping voice would have seemed utterly otherworldly. Her prophecies, often ambiguous enough to fit any outcome, were then translated by temple priests into hexameter verse. When King Croesus of Lydia asked if he should attack Persia, the oracle famously replied, "If you cross the Halys River, a great empire will fall." He did, and it was his own. At the heart of this ritual lay the omphalos, a bulbous stone draped in wool netting, believed to mark the center of the world. According to myth, Zeus released two eagles from opposite ends of the earth, and they met at Delphi. The stone wasn't just a symbol, it anchored the temple's cosmic significance, a literal pivot point between heaven and earth. What's fascinating is how Delphi's influence extended far beyond spirituality. City-states consulted the oracle before founding colonies, lawmakers sought divine approval for legal codes, and generals delayed battles for favorable prophecies. The Pythia's words could ignite revolutions or broker peace, all while she sat in a haze of intoxicating gas, her utterances weaving the fabric of history. In a world without science or satellites, the priests of Delphi understood something profound. Prophecy isn't just about seeing the future, it's about controlling the present. For over 1,000 years, the halls of China's imperial courts echoed with the sound of silk slippers shuffling across polished floors. Each delicate step made possible by bones broken in childhood and flesh bound tight as a vice. Foot binding wasn't just a beauty standard, it was a brutal rite of passage that transformed girls' bodies into crafted symbols of pain and privilege, where the ideal foot, the golden lotus, measured no more than 3 inches long. To achieve this excruciating distortion, young girls, often between 4 and 7 years old, would have their toes bent under their soles, then squeezed with tight bandages that snapped arches and crushed bones together over years of relentless pressure. The pain was so severe that many couldn't sleep for weeks, their muffled sobs echoing through homes as their mothers tightened the bindings each night. The origins of this practice are shrouded in legend. Some say it began with a 10th century emperor's obsession with his concubine's tiny, dancer-like feet, while others link it to Confucian ideals of discipline and sacrifice. But what started as an elite fashion statement soon spiraled into a cultural obsession. By the Ming dynasty, unbound feet were seen as vulgar, a mark of peasant labor. A woman's marriage prospects and her family's social standing depended on the perfection of her lotus feet. The binding process itself became a twisted art form. Mothers soaked their daughters' feet in warm water and animal blood to soften them, then snapped the toes backward, securing them with silk strips that cut off circulation. Infections were common. Toes sometimes rotted and fell off, which was ironically seen as a blessing. It made the foot even smaller. Beyond aesthetics, foot binding carried a dark undercurrent of eroticism. Bound feet were hidden in embroidered shoes, only revealed in intimate settings, their malformed shape and unnatural gait fetishized as the pinnacle of feminine allure. Poems compared them to fragrant lilies, and men supposedly drank wine from the tiny shoes at weddings. Yet the reality was far from romantic. Many women endured lifelong disabilities, their feet aching with every step, their bodies leaning on walls or servants to move. The practice's grip on society was so strong that even when the Qing dynasty tried banning it in the 17th century, families resisted. Foot binding had become synonymous with virtue, a woman's willingness to suffer for her family's honor. It wasn't until the early 20th century, amid modernization campaigns and outrage from foreign observers, that the custom finally crumbled. Today, the last surviving women with bound feet live as living relics of a fading tradition. Their twisted bones, a silent testament to the extremes cultures will go to define beauty. To see an X-ray of a bound foot is to witness a skeleton frozen in agony, a stark reminder that behind every ritual, no matter how elegant it seems, lies the weight of human suffering. Imagine a towering figure looming over the landscape, a woven giant with limbs stretched wide, its hollow belly filled with living offerings as flames lick at its feet. This was the Wicker Man, a ritual so shocking that even the battle-hardened Julius Caesar described it with palpable horror in his first-hand account of the Celtic world. According to his writings, the Druids, mysterious priests of ancient Gaul and Britain, constructed colossal effigies from willow branches, then crammed them with humans and animals before setting them ablaze as sacrifices to their gods. The screams of the dying, he claimed, mingled with the crackling of the wicker, a symphony of suffering meant to ensure fertile crops and victory in war. But how much of Caesar's account can we trust? The Romans had a vested interest in painting the Celts as barbarians, justifying their brutal conquests. Modern scholars debate whether the Wicker Man was reality or propaganda. No intact wicker effigies have been found, and some argue the descriptions echo Greek tales of far-off barbarian practices recycled to shock Roman audiences. Yet, even if the scale was exaggerated, archaeology hints at a darker truth. In places like Lindo Moss in England, bog bodies preserved victims of ritual killings show signs of violent deaths that align with Celtic sacrificial customs. One man, known as Lindo Man, had his throat slit, was strangled, and struck on the head before being placed in the bog, a chilling trifecta of violence that suggests ceremonial overkill. The symbolism of the Wicker Man, if it existed, would have been profound. Willow, a tree associated with flexibility and renewal, might have represented the cyclical nature of life and death, the idea that destruction feeds creation. Burning offerings inside it could have been seen as releasing their essence to the gods, a smoky prayer for harmony between the human and divine realms. And the choice of victims, captives, criminals, or even volunteers might have been selected, their deaths framed not as mere executions but as sacred exchanges. What's fascinating is how this ritual, real or embellished, refuses to fade from our imagination. From folk horror films to modern pagan revivals, the Wicker Man endures as a symbol of humanity's capacity for both reverence and cruelty. Whether Caesar witnessed it or invented it, the image lingers, a skeletal giant wreathed in fire, its ashes carrying whispers of a world where life was currency and the gods demanded payment in blood. High in the thin air of the Andes, where glaciers cling to volcanic peaks, the Inca performed a ritual so precise, so chilling, that its victims remain eerily preserved centuries later. Children, handpicked for their perfection, marched to their deaths as gifts to the gods. This was the Capacocha, a ceremony where unblemished boys and girls, some as young as 6, were drugged with coca leaves and maize beer, then left to succumb to the cold on mountainsides, their small bodies becoming eternal offerings to Inti, the sun god. Unlike the blood-soaked sacrifices of other cultures, this was a somber, calculated act of reverence where purity mattered more than pain. Among the most famous of these mummies is Juanita, the Ice Maiden of Ampoto, discovered in 1995 by anthropologist Johann Reinhard. When her frozen body was unearthed from the snow at 20,000 feet, her face was still peaceful, her ceremonial tunic, a vibrant red and white garment woven with intricate geometric patterns, almost perfectly preserved. Forensic analysis revealed her last meal, a simple stew laced with alcohol and coca, likely to ease her into a drowsy, hypothermic sleep. Her skull showed a single, precise blow, perhaps a merciful strike to hasten the end. But what's most striking is her state of preservation. Her skin, her hair, even her internal organs remained intact, frozen in time by the very environment that claimed her. These children weren't chosen at random. They were the empire's finest, physically flawless, often from noble families, raised from infancy with the knowledge that they might one day be selected for this honor. Months before the ritual, they were paraded through Cusco, feasted, and dressed in textiles woven by the empire's most skilled artisans. Their final journey to the summit was a sacred pilgrimage, sometimes spanning hundreds of miles, with priests carrying them partway as their breath grew shallow in the thinning air. The logic behind the Capacocha was deeply tied to Inca cosmology. Mountains weren't just landscapes, they were apus, living deities that controlled weather and fertility. By placing these untouched souls atop the peaks, the Inca believed they were returning life to its source, ensuring the sun's return, the rain's arrival, and the empire's stability. The children didn't just die, they became intermediaries, their spirits forever bridging the human and divine. Recent discoveries have added haunting layers to this practice. On Lulelaco, the world's highest archaeological site, 3 more mummies were found in 2019, their bodies curled in fetal positions, surrounded by miniature gold statues and delicate shell necklaces. One girl, dubbed La Doncella, still had her head resting on her knees as if asleep. Isotope analysis of her hair showed her diet shifted dramatically in her final year, switching from humble potatoes to elite foods like maize and meat, a sign she was being groomed, even cherished before her sacrifice. To modern eyes, it's a paradox, a culture capable of breathtaking engineering and artistry, yet willing to end innocent lives in the name of faith. But for the Inca, there was no contradiction. These children weren't victims, they were divine messengers, their frozen bodies not tombs but doorways. In the silence of those peaks, where the wind howls and the stars blaze unnaturally bright, they remain perfect, preserved, and forever sacred. In the shadow of Mesopotamia's towering ziggurats, where the scent of incense mingled with the murmur of prayers, a practice unfolded that would scandalize modern sensibilities: sacred prostitution. Temple hierodules, women consecrated to goddesses like Ishtar, engaged in sexual rituals not for pleasure or profit, but as acts of divine communion. To outsiders, it might have looked like a brothel. To the Mesopotamians, it was a sacred economy where sex became currency, and intimacy was the highest form of devotion. At the heart of this ritual stood Ishtar, the Babylonian goddess of love and war, whose temples doubled as hubs of both spiritual and carnal power. Pilgrims, men from all walks of life, would visit her shrines, offering payment to lie with a hierodule, believing the act would bless their fields, their herds, or their wives with fertility. The women themselves weren't seen as ordinary prostitutes, but as incarnations of the goddess, their bodies serving as vessels for her divine energy. Cuneiform tablets describe the ritual in poetic terms, calling it the sacred marriage, a reenactment of the union between Ishtar and her consort, Dumuzi, which ensured the earth renewal each spring. But here's where history gets murky. Ancient Greek historians like Herodotus painted vivid, possibly exaggerated accounts of Babylonian women being compelled to serve in the temples at least once in their lives, waiting in courtyards until a stranger tossed a coin into their lap. Some scholars argue this was mistranslation or moralizing gossip, a way for the Greeks to frame their Eastern neighbors as decadent. Others point to legal texts from Mesopotamia that regulated temple sexuality, distinguishing between hierodules and common sex workers, suggesting the practice was real but far more structured than Herodotus implied. Archaeology adds another layer. At sites like Uruk, excavators found rooms adjacent to Ishtar's sanctuaries filled with votive offerings, tiny clay phalluses and fertility figurines hinting at rituals where sex and spirituality intertwined. Yet unlike the Aztec Tezcatlipoca or Viking funeral pyres, this wasn't about blood or death. It was about creation, about channeling desire into something holy. The hierodules' role wasn't just physical. They were singers, weavers, and healers, their lives woven into the temple's daily rhythms. The debate over sacred prostitution reveals a deeper tension: how modern biases shape our view of the past. Was this exploitation dressed in religious garb or a genuine expression of faith? The answer might lie in the middle. For some women, temple service could have been a path to independence in a patriarchal society, a way to own property or gain status. For others, it may have been coercion veiled as piety. What's undeniable is that in Mesopotamia, sex wasn't just a private act. It was a thread in the fabric of the cosmos, as vital to the gods as rain or sunlight. To reduce it to mere commerce misses the point entirely. In those temple chambers, something profound was happening, a ritual where pleasure and prayer became one, and the line between the sacred and the sensual dissolved. Far removed from the sacrificial fires of the Wicker Man or the preserved innocence of Inca child mummies, Japan's Sokushin, Batsu monks pursued enlightenment through one of history's most grueling spiritual trials, a decade-long suicide ritual disguised as self-mummification. Imagine a monk in the snow-locked mountains of Yamagata, sipping a tea laced with yorashi tree sap, a poison so potent it vomited out his bodily fluids while preserving his flesh from decay. This was no quick death, but a slow, excruciating metamorphosis where the line between devotion and self-torture vanished entirely. The process began with 1,000 days of starvation. Monks would abandon all grains, surviving on nothing but nuts, berries, and bark, a diet so harsh it withered their bodies to near skeletons, stripping away fat and moisture that might hasten rot. Then came another 1,000 days of consuming only poisonous yorushi tea, brewed from the same tree used to lacquer samurai armor. The sap induced violent nausea and dehydration, effectively pickling their organs from the inside out. In the final act, the monk would enter a tiny, subterranean stone chamber, assume the lotus position, and chant until his voice faded into silence. A bamboo air tube provided his only connection to the world above, and when his breathing ceased, sometimes after months of meditative waiting, the tube was removed, sealing his tomb for 3 more years. Only then would his brother monks unearth him, inspecting his body for signs of incorruptibility. Few succeeded. Of the hundreds who attempted sokushinbatsu between the 11th and 19th centuries, only 24 mummies remain, their skin stretched taut like leather over their bones, their faces frozen in eerie serenity. The majority decomposed into skeletons, their sacrifices deemed spiritually insufficient. Those who achieved the perfect state of preservation were enshrined as living Buddhas, their mummies dressed in robes and worshipped as vessels of divine wisdom. The most famous Shinyokai Shonin sits upright in Danishibo Temple, his hands still clasped in meditation 6 centuries after his death. What drove these monks to such extremes? In the Shujendo tradition, the body wasn't just a vessel, it was an obstacle. By conquering decay through sheer will, they believed they could cheat death entirely, achieving Nyorai, the state of a Buddha who neither dies nor is reborn. Their mummification wasn't an end, but a transcendence, a refusal to let even decomposition disrupt their eternal meditation. Modern CT scans of these mummies reveal the brutal truth: organs shrunken to pebbles, muscles desiccated into ropes, yet their posture remains flawlessly upright. The Japanese government banned sokushinbatsu in the 19th century, but the mummies endure as both relics and warnings. To stand before one today is to confront the ultimate paradox, a body that refused to rot yet could never truly live. In their hollow eye sockets and gnarled fingers, we see the price of immortality, paid not in gold or blood, but in unbearable patience and pain. Beneath the ruins of ancient Carthage lies a burial ground so unsettling that even seasoned archaeologists hesitate when interpreting its purpose. The Tophet's sun-baked sanctuaries filled with tiny urns holding charred infant bones tell a story that challenges modern morality. For centuries, Carthaginians supposedly offered their firstborn sons and daughters to Baal Hammon, the god of storms and fertility, burning them alive during times of famine or war as the ultimate plea for divine intervention. But was this ritual truly as monstrous as Roman historians claimed? Or is there another side to these haunting remains? The evidence is as chilling as it is ambiguous. Thousands of burial stelae have been unearthed, many inscribed with the same phrase, "To Baal Hammon that which was vowed." The accompanying imagery, a priest holding a child over an altar, flames licking upward, seems damning. Roman accounts, like those of Diodorus Siculus, describe bronze statues of Baal with outstretched arms, where children allegedly rolled into a pit of fire as drums drowned out grieving parents' cries. But recent archaeology complicates this narrative. Some urns contain fetal bones or infants who died of natural causes, leading scholars like Josephine Quinn to argue that Tophets were simply burial sites for stillborns or children lost in infancy, their sacrifice symbolic rather than literal. Yet the debate rages on. Chemical analysis of the bones reveals something startling. Many show signs of exposure to consistent high heat, suggesting deliberate cremation rather than mere burial. And the demographics are suspicious. The majority are under 2 years old, with a disproportionate number of boys, hinting at selection rather than natural mortality. The most provocative theory: Carthaginians may have practiced both burying deceased children in the Tophet and, during extreme crises, resorting to live sacrifice as a last resort. The emotional weight of these sites is inescapable. Some stelae bear personal names: to Bal Hammon, my son Hanno, while others show parents clutching their children in tender embraces before parting. This wasn't faceless brutality, it was a culture wrestling with desperation, convinced that a child's life might spare an entire city. Today, standing before those rows of small urns, we're left with an unanswerable question. Were the Carthaginians monsters, or were they simply parents who loved their children enough to give up what they held dearest when the world seemed to end? The Tophets whisper, but they don't speak, and in that silence, history holds its breath. Fire was meant to cleanse, to purify, but in one of Hinduism's most controversial rituals, it became the ultimate test of a woman's devotion. Sati, the ancient practice where widows would climb onto their husband's funeral pyres and burn alive, wasn't just death. It was a sacred spectacle, a public performance of loyalty so extreme it blurred the line between martyrdom and coercion. The roots of this ritual stretch back over 2 millennia, intertwining with Hindu texts like the Vedas and Puranas, where sati was framed as the ultimate act of wifely virtue. But behind the spiritual ideal lay a darker reality: societal pressure, economic disenfranchisement, and in some cases outright force. The ritual itself followed a grim script. After a man's death, his widow, often dressed in her wedding finery, would be led to the pyre, sometimes drugged with opium or coerced by relatives. In some accounts, she would place her husband's head in her lap as flames engulfed them both. In others, she'd walk ceremoniously around the pyre before lying beside his body. Regional variations added chilling nuances. In Rajasthan, sati was often linked to royal prestige, with queens expected to join their kings in death to prevent remarriage or claims to the throne. Bengali widows, meanwhile, faced especially brutal pressures. Colonial records describe women being tied to the pyre with green bamboo, which resisted burning longer, ensuring they couldn't escape once the fire began. What's often overlooked is how sati was rarely universal, even in its heyday. It was primarily a practice among elite castes, tied to property inheritance and patriarchal control. A widow's death erased any claim to her husband's wealth, leaving it solely in male hands. British colonial administrators, horrified by the practice, outlawed it in 1829, but enforcement was patchy. Missionary accounts from the era reveal a disturbing grey area. Some women were celebrated as saints for choosing sati, while others were clearly pushed, their protests drowned out by chanting crowds. Yet the practice didn't vanish overnight. As recently as 1987, 18-year-old Roop Kanwar's sati in Rajasthan sparked national outrage. Eyewitnesses claimed she willingly walked into the flames, but activists pointed to inconsistencies: her in-laws' sudden land transfers afterward, the fact she'd only been married 8 months. The case forced modern India to confront a question it thought it had buried. How much of sati was faith, and how much was familial greed? Today, glorifying sati is illegal, but whispers persist. In remote villages, shrines still honor sati martyrs, their stones stained with vermilion as if the blood of centuries past still seeps through the cracks. To understand sati is to grapple with a paradox, a ritual that could be both deeply personal and brutally systemic. For some women, it may have been a genuine expression of love or spiritual conviction. For others, it was the final act in a life scripted by others, where fire wasn't a choice but the only door left unbarred. In the smoke of those pyres lingers a haunting truth: devotion and oppression can wear the same face, and the line between sacred and sinister is often written in ashes. Few images from the Viking age strike terror like the blood eagle, a brutal execution method where victims were said to be carved open while alive. their ribs splayed like wings and lungs pulled outward to mimic a grotesque avian silhouette. The sagas describe it in chilling detail. The victim forced face down, their back sliced open along the spine, ribs severed from the vertebrae with an axe, and finally, the lungs draped over their shoulders like a crimson cloak. As the condemned gasped for air, their own breathing would flutter the tissue, completing the illusion of a dying eagle in flight. But how much of this was real, and how much was poetic embellishment to vilify the Norse as monsters? The historical record is frustratingly thin. Only a handful of accounts survive, primarily in late Icelandic sagas like the Orkneyinga saga and Tale of Ragnar's Sons, where the blood eagle serves as revenge for slain fathers or kings. Scholars like Caitlin Ellis point out these texts were written centuries after the events they describe, by Christian authors with motives to exaggerate Viking barbarity. Forensic archaeology adds another layer of doubt. No skeletal evidence has ever been found matching the ritual's specific trauma, but absence doesn't mean impossibility. We know the Norse practiced ritualistic killings. Bog bodies like the brutally dismembered Renswuhern man in Germany show they were capable of extreme violence. The blood eagle might not have been common, but as a terror tactic reserved for sworn enemies, it's plausible in some form. The symbolic weight of the act is equally compelling. Eagles weren't just birds to the Norse, they were Odin's creatures, symbols of battle and divine favor. By transforming a man into an eagle, the executioners may have been offering their victim to Odin himself, turning murder into a twisted sacrament. Some historians suggest the ritual was less about literal rib splaying and more about a stylized form of sacrifice, perhaps cutting an eagle shape into the back, then letting the victim bleed out. The saga's over-the-top descriptions could be metaphorical, blending reality with myth to heighten the horror. One of the most infamous alleged victims is King Aelle of Northumbria, butchered by Ivar the Boneless in retribution for murdering Ragnar Lothbrok. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a far more contemporary source, mentions Aelle's death but omits any mention of the blood eagle, focusing instead on his defeat in battle. This discrepancy raises questions. Was the blood eagle a later invention to make Ivar's vengeance more cinematic? Or was it so rare that only the Skalds, the Norse poets, deemed it worthy of remembrance? Modern experiments shed light on the logistics. Biomechanical studies suggest that while severing the ribs from the spine is anatomically possible, exposing the lungs without immediate fatal collapse is unlikely. The victim would die from shock or blood loss long before the wings could be fully displayed. This doesn't disprove the ritual, it just reframes it. Perhaps the blood eagle wasn't a prolonged torture but a dramatic, fatal wounding followed by post-mortem mutilation, designed to humiliate and terrify witnesses. What lingers isn't just the grisly mechanics but the cultural shadow it casts. The blood eagle, whether fully real or partly myth, became a psychological weapon, a story so horrifying it deterred betrayal and cemented Viking infamy. In the sagas, it's never just punishment, it's theater, a moment where violence transcends brutality and becomes legend. To dismiss it outright is to ignore the Norse capacity for ritualized cruelty, but to accept it uncritically is to fall for centuries-old propaganda. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the marrow between fact and fear. Deep in the misty forests of New Zealand, warriors once wore their stories not just on their skin, but on their very bones after death. The Maori practice of preserving tattooed heads, known as mokamokai, transformed fallen enemies and revered ancestors into sacred artifacts, their intricate facial tattoos frozen in time through a meticulous preservation process. But what began as a cultural tradition spiraled into a colonial nightmare, with these revered heads becoming grotesque trophies traded for muskets and money halfway across the world. The process of creating mokamokai was both an art and a science. After death, the head would be carefully removed, its brain and eyes extracted, and the cavities packed with flax fiber. The skin was then steamed, smoked over open fires, and treated with shark oil to prevent decay, a method so effective that centuries later, the tattoos remained strikingly vivid. But these weren't just any markings. The tamoko, the traditional facial tattoos, told entire life stories, lineage, status, even personal achievements carved into the skin with chisels rather than needles, leaving grooves so deep they became part of the skull itself. For the Maori, mokomokai were more than keepsakes, they were living records. Heads of chiefs and warriors were displayed during sacred ceremonies, their presence believed to channel ancestral wisdom, while those of enemies served as warnings or objects of negotiation between tribes. Then came the Europeans. By the early 19th century, British explorers and traders developed a macabre obsession with these preserved heads, swapping them for firearms and flooding the international curiosity market. Museums and private collectors clamored for mokomokai, displaying them alongside taxidermied animals as exotic oddities. The demand grew so intense that some Maori tribes began tattooing slaves, sometimes against their will, specifically to kill and preserve them for trade. The very practice meant to honor the dead had been perverted into a commercial horror. In recent decades, a movement to right these wrongs has gained momentum. Institutions like the British Museum, which once proudly exhibited mokomokai in glass cases, now face pressure to repatriate them to New Zealand. Since 2008, over 500 heads have been returned through formal agreements, many welcomed home with emotional ceremonies where elders weep over ancestors finally freed from display cabinets. Yet hundreds remain scattered worldwide, their identities lost to time, their tattoos silent beneath museum storage lights. The legacy of mokomokai is a paradox, a sacred tradition turned colonial commodity, now caught between cultural reclamation and unresolved theft. To see a mokomokai today is to witness a face that refused to fade, its tamoko still declaring centuries later, "I was here, I mattered." And perhaps that's the most powerful ritual of all memory, outliving even the bones that carry it. On the windswept hills outside ancient Persian cities like Yazd and Mumbai, circular towers rise like silent sentinels, structures designed not for the living, but as final resting places where the dead could return to nature in the purest way possible. These were the dakmas, or towers of silence, the heart of Zoroastrian sky burials, a ritual that turned death into an ecological act of reverence. Unlike cultures that buried or burned their dead, Zoroastrians considered corpses najis, ritually unclean, believing contact with decaying flesh would defile the sacred elements of earth and fire. Their solution was as elegant as it was unsettling, placing bodies atop open towers for vultures to strip the bones clean within hours. The ceremony began long before death. Followers of Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, viewed the soul's journey as a 3-day process. After passing, the body was washed with bull's urine and water, then dressed in white muslin, a symbol of purity, before being carried by nacelers, professional pallbearers who avoided direct contact using iron nails in their gloves. The procession to the dakma was solemn, with mourners following at a distance to prevent spiritual contamination. Once at the tower, the body was laid bare on stone slabs, arranged in concentric circles, men outermost, women in the middle, and children closest to the center, where the vultures descended first, as if sparing the youngest prolonged exposure to the sun. These towers weren't random constructions. Their circular shape symbolized the cyclical nature of existence, while the arid, elevated locations ensured no blood or fluids could seep into the ground. The efficiency was staggering. A flock could reduce a body to bones in under an hour, leaving the sun to bleach the remains before they were collected and placed in an ossuary pit at the tower's center. For Zoroastrians, this wasn't just practical, it was deeply theological. Their dualist worldview pitted Ahura Mazda, the god of light, against Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit. By avoiding burial or cremation, they denied Angra Mainyu any foothold in corruption, returning flesh to the food chain while keeping earth and fire unsullied. But modernity has disrupted this ancient equilibrium. By the late 20th century, vulture populations across India and Iran collapsed, victims of diclofenac, a livestock painkiller that caused kidney failure in the birds. Without nature's clean-up crew, bodies took days or even weeks to decompose under the sun, forcing Zoroastrians to adapt. Some turned to solar concentrators, using mirrors to accelerate decomposition, while others reluctantly accepted burial in concrete-lined graves to prevent soil contamination. In Mumbai, where the last active dakma stands, the dwindling vulture flocks have sparked debates about conservation versus tradition, with some advocating for captive vulture breeding programs. The Towers of Silence now face an existential crisis. Younger generations raised in cities far from Zoroastrian strongholds often opt for cremation despite its theological complications. Yet for traditionalists, the ritual's beauty endures a final act of generosity where the body, free of ego, becomes sustenance for another creature. In a world obsessed with embalming and sealed caskets, the Dakma whispers a radical truth, that death need not be a battle against nature but a surrender to it. The vultures may vanish, but the philosophy lingers, a reminder that purity isn't just about avoidance but harmony. On the volcanic shores of ancient Hawaii, breaking a sacred law didn't just mean punishment, it meant walking a gauntlet of death. The mokapu, or death marches, were the ultimate enforcement of the kapu system, a web of taboos so strict that stepping in the shadow of a chief or eating forbidden foods could condemn you to a horrifying end. Those accused of violations were forced to march between two lines of warriors armed with clubs and spears, each one striking the condemned as they passed. Few made it to the end alive. This wasn't just execution, it was theater, a brutal reminder that the gods' laws demanded absolute obedience, and even a single misstep could unravel the fragile balance between mortals and the divine. The kapu system governed every aspect of Hawaiian life: what you ate, where you walked, even how you looked at royalty. Women, for instance, were forbidden from eating pork or bananas, foods reserved for men and the gods. The punishment for infractions varied by severity, but the mokapu was reserved for the gravest offenses: defiling a temple, disrespecting an alii chief, or violating the sacred separation between genders during religious ceremonies. What made these marches particularly terrifying was their unpredictability. Sometimes a skilled runner might dodge blows and survive, earning a miraculous pardon. More often, the warrior's strikes were relentless, turning the path into a bloody testament to the kapu's power. Historical accounts from early missionaries describe the aftermath of these rituals: bodies left unburied as warnings, their broken forms a stark contrast to Hawaii's lush landscapes. But the mokapu wasn't just about fear, it was deeply tied to the Hawaiian concept of mana, the spiritual energy that flowed through all things. Breaking kapu wasn't just a crime, it polluted the community's mana, risking famine, earthquakes, or volcanic eruptions. The death march purified that imbalance, restoring order through the ultimate sacrifice. Yet by 1819, the very system that upheld the mokapu crumbled in a single, audacious act. After the death of King Kamehameha the Great, his widow Kahumanu and son Liholiho staged a symbolic revolt. In a feast that shocked the islands, they deliberately ate together, men and women sharing a meal, flouting kapu's most fundamental rule. When no lightning struck them down, the people's faith in the old gods wavered. Within months, temples were abandoned and the mokapu faded into history. The overthrow of the kapu system wasn't just a religious shift, it was a social earthquake. For centuries, these taboos had structured Hawaiian life, dictating class, gender roles, and even survival. Their end paved the way for Christianity, but it also erased a world view where every action, from farming to fishing, was a sacred act. Today, the mokapu lingers as a grim footnote, a reminder of how power, once unquestioned, can vanish in the space of a single meal. The stones where warriors once stood now sit silent, their shadows stretching long over the sands, whispering of a time when the gods demanded blood. and the price of order was measured in broken bodies. High in the Himalayan peaks, where the air grows thin and the line between life and death blurs, Tibetan Buddhist monks practiced a ritual so extreme it made even seasoned ascetics pause. Churd, meaning to sever, wasn't just meditation, it was a radical act of psychological alchemy, where practitioners deliberately confronted their deepest fears by visualizing their own bodies being torn apart and offered to demons. Picture a lone figure seated among rotting corpses in a charnel ground, chanting into the night, a trumpet crafted from a human thigh bone pressed to their lips. This was spiritual warfare at its most visceral, a battle against the illusion of self. The ritual's origins trace back to the 11th century Yogini Machig Labdrön, who taught that enlightenment could only be achieved by dismantling the ego's grip. Churd practitioners, known as Churdpas, would journey to burial sites or battlefields, places thick with the energy of death, and begin their grim visualization. Closing their eyes, they'd imagine their consciousness leaving their body, floating above it as a wrathful Dakini, a divine demoness descended with a cleaver. Methodically, she'd hack their flesh from bone, flaying limbs, cracking ribs, scooping out organs into a skull-cup cauldron. The visualization was excruciatingly detailed, the sound of tendons snapping, the warmth of blood pooling, the scent of iron in the air. This wasn't self-harm, it was ego annihilation, a way to starve the mind's attachment to physical form. The rituals often unfolded to the eerie drone of the kangling, a trumpet carved from a human femur. These instruments weren't macabre trophies but sacred tools, their hollow tones believed to summon spirits and shatter illusions. Only thigh bones from specific donors, those who had willingly offered their bodies before death, could be used, ensuring the instrument carried spiritual potency rather than karmic burden. The kangling sound wailing across the mountains served as both invitation and warning. Demons and enlightened beings alike were beckoned to feast on the practitioner's imagined remains. What makes Churd so fascinating is its paradoxical goal, to transmute terror into transcendence. By willingly surrendering their bodies in meditation, Churdpas sought to prove that the self was an illusion, as impermanent as the corpses surrounding them. Some accounts describe masters testing their disciples by staging real threats, sending them into caves where bandits lurked or leaving them exposed to blizzards. Survival wasn't the point, liberation was. Modern practitioners still perform Churd, though often in sanitized forms, meditation halls replacing charnel grounds, synthesized kangling sounds replacing actual bone trumpets. Yet the essence remains. In a world obsessed with self-preservation and identity, Churd whispers a radical truth that to hold nothing sacred, not even your own flesh, might be the ultimate freedom. The thigh-bone trumpet's cry echoes across centuries, a reminder that sometimes the path to light begins in the darkest places of the mind. Among the echoing halls of Rome's grand temples, where the scent of burning fat clung to the air, a priest's trembling hands would lift a slick, glistening mass of flesh, not in disgust but in reverence. This was the sacred liver of a freshly slaughtered sheep, and to the haruspex, Rome's diviner priest, its every lobe, vein, and blemish held messages from the gods. Haruspicy, the art of reading divine will in animal entrails, wasn't just superstition. It was statecraft, a ritual so integral to Roman decision-making that no major battle or political move began without it. And at the heart of this practice lay a paradox. The Romans, famed for their legal codes and engineering marvels, entrusted their empire's fate to the quirks of a sheep's liver. The ritual followed an exacting script. A flawless, white-fleeced animal, often a sheep, though goats and cattle were also used, was led to the altar, its hide brushed with sacred oil and its head sprinkled with wine to ensure purity. The haruspex, clad in a traditional conical hat, would slit the animal's belly with a bronze knife, catching the liver before it touched the ground, for even a single drop of mud could render the reading void. Then came the meticulous inspection. The liver was divided into 16 regions, each corresponding to a different deity or aspect of life. A swollen gallbladder might warn of impending war. A missing lobe could signal divine displeasure. The priest would trace his fingers along the portal vein, searching for twists or anomalies, while assistants recorded every detail on wax tablets for the Senate's review. This practice wasn't native to Rome. The Etruscans, the mysterious civilization that predated Roman rule in Italy, had perfected haruspicy centuries earlier, mapping the liver's zones with astonishing precision. Their bronze liver model, discovered in Piacenza, resembles an ancient GPS, its surface etched with the names of gods like Tinia, Jupiter, and Uni, Juno. When Rome absorbed Etruria, they didn't just adopt the ritual, they weaponized it. Generals like Scipio Africanus allegedly delayed battles until the livers looked favorable, while emperors used haruspicy to justify everything from tax hikes to executions. Yet not everyone took it seriously. Emperor Claudius, known for his scholarly wit, once mocked the practice during Vitellius's reign. After a haruspex presented a liver deemed unreadable, possibly malformed or diseased, Claudius quipped that the organ wasn't divine, it was just stupid. The joke, recorded by Suetonius, reveals a quiet skepticism simmering beneath Rome's piety. Even as priests solemnly passed bile ducts, intellectuals like Cicero openly questioned how a sheep's liver could possibly predict human affairs. Modern science offers a grim explanation for some ominous liver's parasites. Sheep infected with liver flukes often develop cysts and scars, which might explain why certain readings warned of plague or famine. But for the Romans, the ritual's power lay in its theater. The splash of blood, the priest's furrowed brow, the hushed crowd, all transformed a butcher's chore into divine dialogue. In a world without satellites or sonar, the liver was a map not of terrain but of fate, and in its slippery contours, Rome sought not just answers but the illusion of control. To hold a liver was to hold the god's whisper, however faint, however flawed. The legacy of haruspicy lingers in unexpected places. The word hepatoscopy still appears in medical texts, and the Etruscan bronze liver model remains a masterpiece of ancient anatomy. But perhaps its truest descendant is our own hunger for certainty, the way we still search for patterns in chaos, whether in tea leaves, stock markets, or the night sky. The Romans knew one thing we've forgotten. Sometimes it's not about the truth of the sign, but the courage to believe in it. In the bitter cold of the late 19th century, across the ravaged plains where bison bones bleached in the sun, a whisper spread like wildfire among the shattered tribes of the American West, a prophecy that the dead would rise, the buffalo would return, and the bullets of the white man would fall harmlessly to the earth. This was the ghost dance, a spiritual movement that swept through Native American nations like a final, desperate prayer. Its followers wore shirts painted with sacred symbols, believing these garments could repel bullets, while their feet stamped in hypnotic circles. The rhythm meant to summon ancestors and heal a broken world. But what began as an act of hope would end in one of history's most harrowing massacres, staining the snow at Wounded Knee with the blood of those who danced for salvation. The ghost dance was born from the visions of a Paiute prophet named Wovoka. In 1889, during a solar eclipse, he claimed to have met the Great Spirit, who promised a rebirth of the land if native people lived righteously and performed this sacred dance. Wovoka's message was one of peace, no vengeance, no violence, yet it spread with revolutionary fervor among tribes like the Lakota, who had lost everything to broken treaties and forced assimilation. For them, the dance wasn't just ritual, it was resistance. The shirts, adorned with eagles, stars, and spirit animals, became armor against despair. The earth is old, the dancers chanted, but it will be new again. But to the US government, the ghost dance was a threat. Officials feared it would unite tribes in rebellion, and the army moved swiftly to suppress it. The Lakota leader Sitting Bull was murdered during an arrest attempt, and in December 1890, tensions exploded at Wounded Knee Creek. As soldiers attempted to disarm a group of Lakota, a single shot rang out. No one knows from which side, and the cavalry opened fire with Hotchkiss guns, tearing through men, women, and children. Many wore their ghost shirts, still clinging to the belief they were invincible. The snow turned red that day, and with it died not just hundreds of lives, but a vision of renewal. The tragedy at Wounded Knee exposed the cruel irony of the ghost dance. Its promise of invulnerability had made followers targets, their faith twisted into a pretext for slaughter. Yet the dance's roots ran deeper than bullets could reach. Fragments of the ritual survived in secret, carried like embers in the hearts of survivors. Today, some tribes still perform versions of the ghost dance, not as a plea for miracles, but as a memorial, a reminder that even in the face of annihilation, the will to hope can outlast empires. To stand where the dancers once stood is to hear echoes in the wind, not just of loss, but of a dream that refuses to die. The frenzy of Dionysian worship reached its bloodiest climax in the Sparagmos, a ritual so visceral it blurred the line between devotion and delirium. Imagine a moonlit forest throbbing with the pulse of drums as followers of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, worked themselves into a trance so deep they could tear apart live animals with their bare hands. This wasn't mere slaughter, it was a sacred rupture where worshippers became the god's vessels, their fingers clawing at flesh as if the act itself could bridge the human and divine. The most haunting account comes from Euripides the Bacchae, where King Pentheus, disguised to spy on the Maenads, Dionysus's female devotees, is mistaken for a mountain lion and ripped limb from limb by his own mother, Agave. Her hands drip with her son's blood before she realizes too late what she's done. Archaeologists and historians have long debated how literal these accounts were. Some argue the Sparagmos was purely symbolic, a mythic exaggeration to underscore the dangers of unchecked ecstasy. Others point to physical evidence, bone fragments found in Greek sanctuaries showing butcher marks consistent with tearing, not careful dissection. The ritual may have begun with animals like goats or fawns, their flesh shared raw among the worshippers in a communal feast that mirrored Dionysus's own mythic dismemberment by the Titans. But whispers persist of darker variations where human sacrifices, often outsiders or criminals, were incorporated into the frenzy. A 5th century BCE vase painting from southern Italy depicts a Maenad gripping a severed head, her face alight with something between rapture and horror. The key to understanding Sparagmos lies in the altered states that preceded it. The Maenads didn't just drink wine, they likely consumed kykeon, a brew laced with ergot or other hallucinogens, inducing visions of Dionysus manifesting as a bull or serpent. In this chemical haze, boundaries dissolved between self and God, human and beast, life and death. To tear apart an animal was to channel the god's primal energy, to taste the wildness he embodied. Modern scholars like Karl Ruck posit that these rites were a form of entheogenic theater, where the violence served as a brutal metaphor for spiritual rebirth. Just as grapes must be crushed to make wine, the Sparagmos shattered the old self to make way for divine ecstasy. Yet the ritual's legacy is a paradox. The same Greeks who staged bloody renditions of the Bacchae in their theaters also outlawed private Dionysian cults, fearing their destabilizing power. The Sparagmos was both revered and reviled, a reminder that ecstasy, untamed, could topple kings and unravel minds. Today, in the quiet ruins of Dionysian temples, you can almost hear the echo of drums and tearing flesh, a ghostly testament to the human hunger for transcendence, however terrible the cost. In the frozen heart of Siberia, where winter temperatures plummet to 50 degrees below zero, survival demanded more than resilience. It required a pact with the very animals that made life possible. For the Evenki people, nomadic reindeer herders who navigated the harshest landscapes on Earth, that pact was sealed with warm, steaming blood drawn straight from the veins of their herds. This wasn't mere sustenance, it was a ritual of interdependence where humans and reindeer existed in a cycle of giving and taking that bordered on sacred. Picture a herder bending close to a living reindeer's neck, making a small incision with a bone knife, then drinking deeply as the blood pooled into a wooden cup or directly into their mouth. The reindeer, unharmed if the cut was precise, would heal within days, its gift ensuring its human companions could face another week of merciless cold without collapsing from exhaustion or scurvy. The logic behind this practice was as practical as it was profound. Reindeer blood is staggeringly rich in nutrients packed with iron to stave off anemia, vitamin D to compensate for months without sunlight, and enough protein to replace scarce plant foods during winter's grip. For the Evenki, who might go weeks without fresh meat, it was liquid vitality, but there was a spiritual dimension too. The act of drinking blood bound herder and reindeer in an unspoken covenant. These weren't just livestock, they were guides, their antlers said to touch the spirit world. To take their blood was to absorb their strength, their endurance, their very essence. Parallels echo across the steppes in the traditions of Genghis Khan's Mongol warriors, who reportedly drank horse blood during long campaigns when food ran low. Both cultures shared a worldview where animals were partners, not property. Yet where the Mongols saw blood as wartime ration, the Evenki elevated it to ritual. Certain ceremonies demanded specific reindeer, a white one for blessings, a pregnant female for fertility rites. The blood wasn't just consumed, it was offered to spirits, dabbed on shamans' drums, or smeared on children's faces for protection. Modern perspectives clash violently with this ancient practice. Animal rights groups decry it as cruelty, despite ethnographic accounts stressing the Evenki's meticulous care to avoid harming their herds. A botched cut could spoil the meat or invite infection, so skill and restraint were paramount. Today, as younger generations trade nomadism for city life and synthetic vitamins replace traditional remedies, the ritual fades. Yet it raises urgent questions. Who gets to define ethical survival? Is it worse to drink a cup of blood from a creature you've raised since birth, or to buy factory-farmed meat shipped across continents, its suffering invisible? In the silence of the taiga, where reindeer still outnumber people, the old ways whisper a challenge to our neatly packaged morality. The Evenki didn't just take blood, they gave something in return, a lifetime of guardianship, a place in their cosmology, a respect so deep it flowed both ways. That reciprocity, that raw intimacy between species, might be the most shocking ritual of all. In the remote highlands of Ethiopia, where the Omo River carves through sun-baked valleys, the Mersey and Sama tribes carry a tradition that defies conventional beauty standards: lip plates, circular discs of clay or wood stretching the lower lip into a wide, distended oval. What began as a rite of passage for young women has become one of Africa's most visually striking rituals, a living testament to identity, resilience, and the weight of colonial gaze. The process begins in adolescence, when a girl's lower lip is pierced and gradually stretched over months or years, first with a small wooden plug, then with larger plates until the lip can accommodate discs measuring up to 5 inches across. The final plate, often intricately carved or painted, isn't just adornment. It's a badge of womanhood, signaling readiness for marriage and social status within the tribe. Yet behind this practice lies a web of myths and misconceptions. Early European explorers and colonial photographers sensationalized lip plates, framing them as symbols of savagery or exotic curiosity. Postcards circulated in the 19th century depicted Mersey women as spectacles, their bodies reduced to props in a narrative of otherness. What these outsiders missed was the ritual's deeper symbolism. For the Mersey, the lip plate, called Debaya Tugoin, is intertwined with notions of strength and self-expression. During ceremonies, women remove their plates and let their lips flap freely, a gesture of pride and defiance. Some elders claim the practice originated as a deliberate disfigurement to deter slave traders, making women less desirable to raiders. Others argue it mirrors the Omo River's cyclical floods, the stretched lip echoing the curves of clay pots used to carry water, a homage to the land that sustains them. The ritual's survival is fraught with tension. younger generations, increasingly exposed to global influences through education and tourism, often reject the practice as outdated or impractical. In towns near Mersey territories, it's not uncommon to see teenage girls wearing plates only during cultural performances for paying visitors, then removing them to attend school or interact with the wider world. The Ethiopian government has sent mixed signals officially celebrating the tribes as cultural heritage while quietly discouraging lip plating as backward. Tourism dollars further complicate the picture. While visitors pay handsomely to photograph lip-plated women, the economic incentive risks turning a sacred tradition into a transactional performance divorced from its original meaning. Archaeology offers a surprising twist. Lip plating isn't unique to Africa. Ancient Maya artifacts show figures with stretched lips, and indigenous groups in Amazonia and Melanesia practiced similar modifications. This global thread suggests a shared human impulse to reshape the body as a canvas for belonging. But for the Mersey and Sama, the plate is more than ornament, it's a language. The size and decoration can denote marital status, lineage, or even personal grief. A woman might enlarge her plate after the death of a child, the physical strain mirroring her emotional weight. The future of this ritual hangs in a delicate balance. As smartphones and sneakers filter into the Omo Valley, the lip plate stands at a crossroads between preservation and adaptation, between the expectations of ancestors and the aspirations of the young. To dismiss it as mere primitivism is to ignore its layered history. To romanticize it risks freezing the tribes in time. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, in the hands of those who wear them, stretching not just their lips but the very definition of beauty itself. On the lush island of Bali, where towering volcano peaks loom over emerald rice terraces, teenagers undergo a rite of passage that would make most dental patients shudder: the ceremonial filing of their canine teeth. Known as metatar, this sacred Hindu ritual isn't about aesthetics. It's a spiritual amputation, a deliberate dulling of the animal within. The Balinese believe the sharp points of the canines symbolize the sad ripu, the 6 destructive inner enemies: lust, greed, anger, confusion, drunkenness, and jealousy. By grinding these teeth flat, they're not just reshaping smiles, they're taming the primal forces that could derail a soul's journey toward harmony. The ceremony unfolds like a vibrant collision of celebration and solemnity. Before dawn, the family prepares an elaborate feast towering pyramids of fruit, intricately woven palm leaf offerings, and saffron rice molded into floral shapes. The teenager, dressed in traditional Yudeng headcloth and golden sash, sits cross-legged before a priest as relatives gather, their faces a mix of pride and nervous anticipation. The priest begins with chants in ancient Sanskrit, calling upon the gods to bless the ritual. Then, without anesthesia or modern tools, a metal file is pressed against the first canine. The grating sound echoes through the courtyard as enameled dust falls onto a banana leaf below, each stroke a deliberate act of surrender. What's striking is the ritual's layered symbolism. The teeth aren't just filed randomly. The priest ensures all 6 points, one for each negative trait, are smoothed evenly, leaving a perfectly level plane. A single drop of blood is caught in a coconut shell, mixed with herbs and dabbed on the forehead as a purifying seal. The filed teeth, now civilized, are said to prevent the child from becoming Rakshasa, a demonic creature driven by base desires. Meanwhile, the family's laughter and chatter never cease. This isn't a somber event, it's a rameh, a Balinese term for joyous chaos, where sacred and social intertwine seamlessly. But beneath the festivity lies a deeper philosophy. In Bali, the mouth is considered a gateway not just for food or speech, but for spiritual pollution. Sharp canines, relics of our carnivorous ancestry, represent untamed nature. Filing them mirrors the Hindu Balinese ideal of Trihita Karana, balance between humans, gods, and nature. It's no coincidence that the ritual coincides with puberty, the age when primal urges awaken. By dulling the teeth, the community acknowledges those urges while ritually declawing them. Modernization has nudged the tradition into curious adaptations. Some families now opt for dentists to perform the filing with sterilized equipment, though purists insist the priest's hand must guide the file. Tourists occasionally witness metata as part of cultural shows, but these staged versions lack the intimacy of a true family ritual. For the Balinese, the ceremony remains a visceral reminder that maturity isn't just about growing up, it's about filing down, sanding away the edges of the self to fit into the divine order. The flattened teeth become a lifelong emblem, a mouth that can still taste life's sweetness but never bite back. The summer of 1518 in Strasbourg was supposed to be a time of harvest, but instead, the streets became a stage for one of history's most baffling spectacles. A plague not of boils or fevers, but of dance. It began quietly, almost innocuously, when a woman named Frau Trophia stepped into the square and began to twitch, her limbs moving without her consent. Within days, dozens more joined her, their bodies jerking and spinning in a relentless, manic rhythm. By the end of the month, over 400 people were caught in the grip of this dancing madness, their feet bloody from days without rest, their cries for help drowned out by the gasps of onlookers and the frantic piping of musicians hired by baffled officials who believed the dancers needed to wear themselves out. What caused this epidemic of involuntary movement? One theory points to ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on damp rye and produces chemicals similar to LSD. When consumed in contaminated bread, it can trigger hallucinations, convulsions, and a sensation of burning limbs, symptoms that might explain why the dancers described feeling an unbearable heat they could only quench by thrashing. Strasbourg had endured a year of catastrophic floods and failed crops, creating the perfect conditions for ergot to thrive. But the dancing plague wasn't just a physiological reaction, it was a mirror of medieval Europe's collective psyche. The people of Strasbourg were living through an era of relentless suffering, famine, the bubonic plague's lingering shadow, and the crushing weight of feudal oppression. Their bodies, it seems, revolted when their voices couldn't. Yet mass hysteria can't be dismissed. Historical records describe similar outbreaks across Europe, from the Tarantism of Italy where victims danced to cure spider bites, to the convulsive pilgrimages of the Middle Ages. These events often followed waves of trauma, as if the body's response to unbearable stress was to surrender to a kind of contagious catharsis. In Strasbourg, the dancers weren't just random victims. Many were poor laborers, the same people who'd borne the brunt of that year's disasters. Their dancing wasn't celebratory, it was frantic, agonized, as if their bodies had become prisons and movement was the only key. The city's response only deepened the horror. Authorities, convinced this was a curse or divine punishment, banned music and gambling, then reversed course and erected stages, believing the dancers needed to exhaust themselves to break the spell. Musicians were paid to play faster, doctors prescribed bloodletting, and priests led processions to shrines, all while the dancers collapsed from exhaustion, some dying of strokes or heart attacks. The plague only faded when the afflicted were gradually carted away to mountaintop sanctuaries, where the cold air and isolation seemed to calm their fevered limbs. The dancing plague endures as a chilling reminder of how easily the mind and body can unravel under pressure. Today, we might diagnose it as a psychogenic movement disorder or a stress-induced breakdown, but the deeper truth remains. Sometimes, when the world becomes too much to bear, the body finds its own language of protest. In Strasbourg squares 6 centuries ago, that language was dance, a silent, screaming testament to the price of despair. The music has long faded, but the questions linger. Were they poisoned, possessed, or simply pushed to the brink? Perhaps all three, and perhaps in their uncontrollable steps we see a reflection of our own breaking points, the ways we, too, might spiral when the weight of the world leaves no other outlet. From the blood-stained temples of the Aztecs to the frozen stillness of Inca child mummies, These 25 rituals reveal something startling: humanity's capacity to transform pain, fear, and devotion into acts so extreme they defy modern logic. Each practice, no matter how shocking, was never arbitrary. They were mirrors of the societies that birthed them. The Viking funeral pyres embodying a culture that saw death as a journey, the Mayan bloodletting rituals reflecting a belief that sacrifice sustained the cosmos, and the Balinese tooth-filing ceremonies revealing a quest for spiritual balance. Even the most grotesque traditions carried a kernel of meaning, whether to control the uncontrollable, to honor the divine, or to mark the fragile line between order and chaos. It's tempting to dismiss these rituals as relics of a darker past, but look closer and you'll see echoes in our own world. The modern obsession with extreme body modification, stretched piercings, subdermal implants, even surgical transformations mirrors the mercy lip plates or Sokushin Batsu mummification, trading spiritual devotion for self-expression. Viral challenges where people endure pain or risk for fleeting fame aren't so different from the dancing plagues of Strasbourg, where desperation manifested in uncontrollable movement. Even our reliance on algorithms and astrology hints at the same hunger for certainty that drove Roman priests to scrutinize sheep livers. The tools have changed, but the human impulse remains: to make meaning, to seek control, to belong. So which ritual left you reeling? Was it the quiet horror of the Capacocha children, preserved in ice for centuries, or the visceral spectacle of the blood eagle? Maybe the ghost dancer's tragic hope resonated most, or the Wicker Man's fiery ambiguity. Share your thoughts below. This is the kind of history that begs discussion. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into the strange and sacred, don't forget to subscribe. After all, the past isn't just a collection of facts, it's a mosaic of human obsession, ingenuity, and sometimes sheer audacity. And somewhere in those fragments, we might just recognize ourselves.